Alright, let's get started. This video is the very first in a series on orchestration that I sincerely hope will actually prove to be one of the better resources on YouTube for anyone who's looking to improve their musical craft. Over the course of the next few videos, we're going to dive into each major section of the orchestra, their instruments, and how to make sure you're actually making the most professional grade orchestral music possible. In this video, we'll start with a very brief overview of the main sections of the orchestra, after which we'll take a little deeper look into the basic building blocks of orchestral music, and we're going to discuss the key strategies for making sure the most important parts of your music are well orchestrated. With that in mind, let's get started. So I'm sure that many of you have a pretty decent idea of what instruments call the orchestra their home. The average orchestra comprises of four main sections. There's the string section, which is made up of instruments like the violin, viola, cello, and bass. There's the brass section, which is home to the French horn, trumpet, trombone, tuba, and others. And there's the woodwind section, which consists of flutes, single reeds, and double reeds. Finally, there's also the percussion section, where you can find pretty much anything that you can make a sound when you hit it. Now, there are all types of music that can be considered as orchestral, but the grand majority of these genres all share the same basic building blocks, which are melody, countermelody, and harmony. Some arguments could be made that texture and rhythm deserve their own mention, but I find that since they exist within and across the first three, I prefer to think of them as more subcategories than building blocks. Now, melody is pretty self-explanatory. It's the general tune or shape of the music that gets stuck in the listener's head. As such, it's typically what we like to call foreground material, or the musical content that is most important for the listeners to notice. Harmony is a little bit broader. It consists of several subcategories. There's the harmonic bed, which is the chord progression. There's harmonic foundation, which is the bass line. There is harmonic voicing, which is sort of like if the melody and harmony got together and had a kid. And then there's comping, which is a more rhythmic approach in which the chords are used to play an important rhythm. All of these tend to stay in the background material. They're important, but usually shouldn't be so prominent that the audience can't or doesn't notice the melody. The countermelody kind of floats in between these two zones and plays in whichever area it is most needed in, the foreground or the background. Oftentimes people like to refer to this as being in the midground. Now, placing the melody in the foreground and the harmony in the background isn't a hard rule. It's just a pretty common and natural tendency. Typically, foreground material is whatever part of your music that you want your audience to pay the most attention to. And your background material is whatever you want to use to support and add to your foreground without taking attention away from it. Most beginning composers find themselves accidentally mixing up their foreground and their background, and end up with arrangements that have no chance at keeping the melody in the forefront or keeping the audience's attention. For example, in this short bit, I orchestrated Mary Had a Little Lamb, but you can barely notice the melody due to everything else that's going on. Fortunately, it's not too difficult to learn how to avoid these types of mistakes. There are only two basic rules you need to keep in mind. Rule number one is that your foreground material should be performed with arrangements that have no chance at keeping the melody in the forefront or keeping the audience's attention. For example, in this short bit, I orchestrated Mary Had a Little Lamb, but you can barely notice the melody due to everything else that's going on. Fortunately, it's not too difficult to learn how to avoid these types of mistakes. There are only two basic rules you need to keep in mind. Rule number one is that your foreground material should be performed in a strong and appropriate register for the instruments that are performing them. Now, what constitutes a strong or appropriate register depends on the instrument you're working with. Typically, it's whatever range of a particular instrument that makes it feel most powerful and heard the easiest. I'll cover the specific registers for each instrument in their respective videos later in the series, but for now, let's just suffice to say that you shouldn't be willy-nilly with your instrument choices when you're orchestrating music. You want to spend at least a little bit of time making sure that you're picking the right ones. Rule number 2 is to pay careful attention to differentiating your foreground material from your background material. There are 5 different traditional methods for differentiating your foreground from your background, and they can be remembered with the anagram PDAR. This stands for pitch, dynamics, articulation, rhythm, and tone color. Pitch differentiation refers to separating the foreground material and the background material by placing them into different pitch registers. For example, the melody could be played in a higher register than the harmony. This is actually the default and preferred way to write them. The reason being that the human ear actually gravitates towards higher pitches. So whatever material is being played in the highest register is going to have an automatic advantage over the lower material. This means that if your melody is written in a higher register than your harmony, then your audience will have a natural tendency to focus on the melody. This doesn't mean that the melody can never be played in a lower register than the harmony, but it does mean that if you do this, you should be deliberate about it. And you need to be aware of the disadvantage you're giving yourself, because if you're aware of it, then you can overcome it by paying careful attention to the other methods of differentiating to make sure that you're keeping it all balanced. The next option is dynamic differentiation, which is pretty straightforward. It's a pretty hard rule that says the foreground material should always be played louder than the background material, even if only by a little bit. Because the moment your background becomes louder than your foreground, it will almost always end up stealing the audience's attention away from the more important material. Now, this doesn't mean that the melody can never be quieter than the harmony. It just means that if the melody is going to be played quieter than other material, it should be done deliberately, with the idea in mind that the other material is more important for whatever reason that might be. The third strategy we have is articulation differentiation, which simply means that you should try separating your foreground material from your background material by giving them different articulations. For example, your melody could be quite short and staccato, while your harmony could be more lyrical and legato. Now, this strategy isn't as polarizing as the first two in terms of one articulation being more powerful than the other. The key idea here is just to make sure that they're performed in different ways. Rhythmic differentiation is another fairly easy and straightforward option. All you need to do is make sure that the foreground and background are being played with different rhythms. This is actually pretty easy to do in most passages, because the melody is the melody. It has its own rhythm, and oftentimes when the harmony is used to play simple sustained chords, by default, that's a different rhythm. But if you start getting fancier, you just want to keep in mind that the melody or foreground material should have a different rhythm than the background material, even if only marginally different. Finally, we have tone color, which is probably one of the most powerful and instinctive but most complicated methods of differentiation. For this, you simply want to make sure that your background and foreground are making use of different tone colors or sound types. Now, this can be as simple as splitting which sections are playing in each area. Like, let's say the strings are playing the melody, while the brass is providing a nice strong bass in the foundation. The string section sounds very different from the brass section. They have different tone colors, they have different sound qualities. And as such, the foreground and background now also have very different sound qualities. This is pretty straightforward, pretty simple, but you can also get more complicated. For example, let's say we want the string section to play both the melody and the harmony, both foreground and background. Well, you can split between, let's say, muted strings playing in the background, while unmuted strings play the foreground. You could have a section providing the background, and you can have a solo player doing the melody. You could even do pizzicato in the background, where they're plucking the strings, versus a arco, or bowing the notes in the foreground. Really, the whole point I'm trying to get at here is that the sky's the limit here. As long as you keep an open mind and get creative with the type of sound your players are using, you want to make sure that you find a way that your foreground has a different sound than your background. Now, you can use as many of these strategies or as few of these strategies as you'd like when you're orchestrating your music. The main point is just to remember that you want to make sure your foreground material grabs the attention of your audience, while the background material helps support it by adding to it from behind. So, just to recap, There are four main sections of the orchestra. There's the string section, the brass section, the woodwind section, and the percussion section. Each of these sections work together to provide the three basic building blocks of orchestral music. There's melody, countermelody, and harmony. Rhythm and texture are also both important traits, but they can be found inside each of these main building blocks. In order to make sure that your music is properly orchestrated and that your foreground material is more prominent than your background material, you should remember these two rules. Number one, foreground material should be played in a strong or appropriate range for the instruments that are playing it. And rule number two, you should pay careful attention to differentiating your foreground and background material. All right, so with that, we've reached the end of the video, and I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank each and every one of you for your incredible support, especially for those of you who sent me those wonderful messages on my website. I really appreciate them. It gave me a much needed kick in the butt to actually start working on this video series for each of you, and I had no idea, honestly, that so many of you were finding this channel useful. When I started this off, I was just doing it to help out a couple friends of mine, and really to help myself too. I really internalized material by teaching it. And so just to know that so many people are making good use out of this series and these videos that I'm sharing, well, it's just incredible to me. So thank you, everyone. If you liked the video and you found it helpful, if you could do me a favor and like it and subscribe to my channel and share it with anyone that you think might also find it useful. Because my goal with this channel really is to try and put out some high quality content and get some good information that was really difficult for me to find when I first started working on learning how to compose music. So, but in the meantime, keep up the hard work and yeah, keep on bringing good new music into this world. Lord knows we need it. So, until next time, see ya.